On December 30th, 2016, a woman sat down at her computer in her New Mexico home and pulled up the video feed from her surveillance system. Everybody in her neighborhood was terrified. There was a killer on the loose, and the police did not seem to have any idea who it could be or what their motivation was. So, on her computer, she scrolled back 2 days and began going through the footage frame by frame, looking for anything suspicious. And for a while, really nothing stood out on this recording. The only thing that really happened was her neighbor came home from a trip at some point, and then some time passed, and then the neighbor left again. That was basically it. And so the woman was starting to think that what she was doing was kind of pointless. Until, all of a sudden, in the corner of the screen, a dark figure appeared. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's bedroom and secretly hide alarm clocks all over the room that are all set to go off at various different points throughout the night. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 28, 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt drove down the highway into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beside him was his 11-year-old daughter, Sienna, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. They'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, all the way from Don's mother's home in California, where they'd just spent Christmas. But the holiday had not really been a happy one, because a few weeks earlier, Don's sister, Janice, had died of breast cancer. And Janice was really one of the only true close family members Don had left. His dad and his other sister were both already dead, and his younger brother Dennis wasn't talking to him after a big argument the year before. So, as soon as Don had gotten the news that Janice had unfortunately passed away, he'd immediately negotiated with his ex-wife to take their daughter, Sienna, and go see his mom. He wished they could have stayed longer, but he had to get back to work. Don had a job at an agency that served the developmentally disabled, and there was a big meeting coming up that he just couldn't miss. Just then, Don slammed on his brakes. Traffic ahead was piling up, and the car in front of him had slowed down to an abrupt stop. Don felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, and he laid on his horn. He was about to roll down the window so he could scream at the driver in front of him, but then he saw Sienna open her eyes in alarm in the seat next to him, and he stopped himself. Don took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just traffic and it wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have kind of a temper when it came to driving, but in recent years, he'd been working hard to control it so he could set a good example for his daughter. So after the traffic finally let up, and as he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through downtown Albuquerque toward his house, Don deliberately tried to shift his focus to something positive. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And that always made Don smile. Spaghetti Sunday was a tradition that he and Sienna had started together a few years ago by making big batches of food every Sunday after church and bringing the food downtown to feed the homeless. At first, it had just been the two of them, but over time, more people had joined in the effort, and pretty soon it had grown into a real event with whole groups of volunteers coming out to serve food and drop off clothes and canned goods. Don felt proud that he'd created something so meaningful for the community, and it was especially important to him that he had done it with Sienna. Finally, Don turned down a quiet residential street and parked in the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse decorated with Christmas lights. He got out of the car with Sienna, grabbed their suitcases, and walked to the front door and unlocked it. And when his daughter stepped inside, she shrieked with excitement, because waiting for her under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle wrapped in a shiny bow. She turned around and asked her dad if she could give the bike a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes, but it was already dark out and this was supposed to be a quick stop at his house, and when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was almost 7. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday, and he had to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a pretty civil relationship, but he knew she would be annoyed if he asked for more time. So Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait, but for now, just go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would leave. As Sienna ran off, Don noticed something strange. He hadn't seen his golden retriever, Buddy, who usually rushed out to greet him whenever he came home. So Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name, and finally found the dog cowering in the bedroom. Don extended his hand, and Buddy skittishly came forward to sniff it. And Don was a little unnerved by this. Buddy usually did not act scared of him. But then again, Don didn't usually leave for weeks at a time either, so he just told himself that, maybe this was just separation anxiety. So he gave Buddy a pat on the head, filled his bowl with kibble, and then grabbed his keys for the short drive to his ex-wife Christine's house. Don drove to Christine's very slowly, trying to enjoy every last bit of his time with Sienna. Don treasured the time he had with his daughter, because the mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost gotten her taken away from him. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life and went to church every Sunday, but it was not always that way. He had partied a lot when he was younger, and when Sienna was a toddler, he'd gotten fired from his dream job as a firefighter for failing a drug test. And then after he'd lost his job, his then wife, Christine, had to shoulder most of the family's bills, and after a few months, the strain on the marriage was just too much. Christine filed for divorce, which was crushing for Don, but even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don actually already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and after that divorce, his first wife had gotten sole custody of those kids and moved them all to Oklahoma, so Don had barely seen them for most of their childhoods. He was determined not to make that same mistake with Sienna. So he'd gone to court to fight Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten a little contentious, but it was worth it, and Don made the most of every moment he got to spend with Sienna. He'd braid her hair before school and make costumes for her school plays, and on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he always called her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway, and Christine came outside and stood by the front door with her arms crossed. She motioned to her watch, clearly annoyed that Don was late. Don got out of the car and sort of apologized and told her it had been a really long drive from California, and they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and they'd hit some traffic. That was why they were late. Christine sighed and said it was okay. She asked about the trip, and Don told her it went well. They had a great Christmas despite the, sadness over his sister's death, and it had been very meaningful just to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and kiss, and then he promised to call her before bed as usual. And when he saw her again that weekend, they'd have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his garage 10 minutes later, he noticed that the trash can at the end of his driveway was lying overturned on its side. So he parked his truck, walked down to the curb, and flipped it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed a button to close the garage door, and unlocked the door to his townhouse. And while he was taking off his shoes and jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing and roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the sensor. He stopped to listen, and now what he heard was the sound of the door actually closing again and actually hitting the ground with a soft thud. He shook his head and decided he must be imagining things. Don dragged his suitcase into the bedroom and began to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and not really think about anything. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he saw a small hole in the ceiling and let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months, and he'd been hoping it would have been done by the time he got home. So he made a mental note to give the landlord yet another call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on and then headed out to the garage to smoke a cigarette. The following morning, December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up and heard Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna told Valerie that her dad did not call her last night and asked if he was there now at the office. So Valerie stood up and peered over at Don's desk, but it was empty. This was a little unusual, since Don was a pretty punctual guy, but it was still early, so she told Sienna not to worry. She would give Don a call now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone, but he didn't answer. So she sent him a text message, and she waited. But after half an hour, Dawn still hadn't replied. And now Valerie was starting to feel concerned. It was not like Dawn to skip work without calling in, and then ignore calls and texts too. And so Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they decided to just go swing by Dawn's townhouse themselves and check on him. The sky over Dawn's townhouse was dark and cloudy when Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked on the door, but to her surprise, it actually just swung right open. She looked over at her coworker, then the two of them nervously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Dawn's name, but he didn't answer, so she wandered into the living room and peeked into the bedroom, but the house seemed empty. Valerie's coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Dawn on the second floor, and Valerie headed out to the garage to see if maybe Dawn's truck was there. And when Valerie opened the door to the two-car garage attached to the townhouse and flipped on the light, she saw Dawn's truck was in its usual spot. But something else caught her eye. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV, she noticed a streak of something dark red on the wall. At this point, Valerie started to feel pretty nervous. But nonetheless, she began walking towards that back wall to see what was going on over there. And as she got closer and closer, she was staring at the streak, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, until finally she was close enough that she could actually look down at the space between the SUV and the red streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, Albuquerque police detective Matthew Kaplan pulled up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse secured with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police officers. Two women wearing business clothes were sitting on the curb, and both of their faces were stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew was that a man had been found dead in a garage attached to this townhouse, and now he, Detective Kaplan, was heading up the investigation. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door, and a policeman standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Fluitt. The two women outside were his coworkers, who had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the women said the front door was open when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse into the living room, and right away he saw a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. Then he did a slow loop through the first and second floors and noted there was a cell phone on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter. It didn't really look like anything had been rifled through. The drawers in the house were not hanging open, and the house generally was neat and orderly. And so on first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan like a robbery. Back on the first floor, Kaplan headed into the garage, where crime scene techs were busy photographing the scene and collecting forensic samples. Kaplan knelt down next to Dawn's body, which was laying face up between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat was cut with a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, his ear, and on his hand, as if he had tried to fight back. There were also signs of blunt force trauma, as if he had been hit by an object like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked closely, he saw burst capillaries on Dawn's eyes and eyelids, which he knew were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent and gruesome, which Kaplan knew meant this was likely personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the blood that was spattered on the walls and refrigerator above Dawn's body, and the bloody handprints on the side of Dawn's truck. There was no blood on the floor around Dawn. However, it sort of appeared like somebody had recently mopped and maybe tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty bottle of bleach on top of the washer nearby. So he walked over, he opened up the washer, and sure enough, he found piles of wet towels inside that actually still smelled like bleach. Just then, a crime scene tech came over carrying luminol spray, which is a chemical used by law enforcement to detect blood. And so Kaplan stepped back so he could spray the area, and then Kaplan followed him around as he made his way through the house. The luminol spray did pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and the sink too, and Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage and then wash their hands or the murder weapon in the kitchen before leaving. But it is much harder to scrub a murder scene than people realize, and so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually recover some of the killer's DNA. Kaplan stepped through the front door just as a car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car and pushed past the crime scene tape, and immediately Kaplan put his hands up to stop him. This man looked totally flustered, and he introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord, and asked what the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped, then started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father and a religious man who would open up his home to anyone and that nobody would want to kill him. But then Benny paused and made a face like something was just occurring to him, and he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did charity work with the homeless, and he said it was possible that somebody from the street could have maybe broken into Don's house and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny, he sent him on his way, and then he just stood on Don's driveway, thinking about what Benny had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder, and the fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, he doubted very much that this had just been a break-in by a random homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Don's killer was someone Don knew, and maybe even someone who had a key, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Don was a big and muscular guy, and it was clear he had fought back with his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially big male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Don Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two co-workers who had called 911 had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan went to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had spoken to Christine the day before just to break the news about her ex-husband's death, and also to see what she might know about the murder. Christine hadn't had any ideas about who would have wanted to hurt Don, but she'd mentioned that he used to have a problem with road rage, and he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so, maybe he had gotten into it with another driver, and maybe they had followed him home. But she also said their daughter had been with him, and she didn't mention anything about that. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had actually told her that his dog was acting skittish when he had gotten back from that road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine as a suspect because she had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at Christine's around 7:45 the night he was killed, and then she and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together. Her road rage idea seemed as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but not particularly helpful in identifying a suspect. But now Kaplan was back at Christine's house because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry, who had been out of town last night for work since he was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Don's ex-wife, he was a natural suspect. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite smile. Kaplan entered the living room, where Christine and Sienna were sitting, and said hello, and then asked them to leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in an armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed calm and friendly as he told the detective that he and Don didn't have much contact with each other, but their relationship was not exactly bad. It was just awkward because of the custody battle Don had had with Christine. Ever since then, Terry said, he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Don. He knew Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked a conflict, Sienna would likely take Don's side. As for the night of Don's murder, Terry told Kaplan he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., and then he left and he stopped at Wendy's on the way to work, and then he took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before going in for his shift. After Kaplan left and went back to the station, he immediately called Terry's sister and also Terry's boss, and they both confirmed Terry's whereabouts, which meant that Terry's alibi was solid, and Kaplan was back to square one on suspects. But while he was writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang with a call from one of Don's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her security camera for the night of Don's murder, and she found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence and drove right to this neighbor's house, where she led him inside, to her computer, where she pressed play. Kaplan leaned in close to the screen and watched the black and white footage of the side of Don's townhouse shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., a few minutes after Kaplan knew that Don and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure tipped over Don's trash can and then walked up the driveway toward Don's garage and disappeared from the screen. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Don driving into the garage and then walking out again to go pick up the trash can and then walking back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Don's garage. Kaplan could see that light dimming, which meant the garage door was closing, but then inexplicably, the door must have begun going back up again because the light began to get bigger. And at the same time, there were several brief flashes of light, and then after the flashes, the light began to dim again, which meant the garage door closed, eventually leaving the driveway in darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video, then left the neighbor's house and walked over to Don's, trying to piece together what actually happened on the video. He stood inside of Don's garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand, and he pressed the button to close the door. And as it closed, Kaplan walked closer until he was almost directly underneath the door's path. And then, when that happened, all of a sudden, the door stopped because Kaplan had actually tripped the sensor by going right underneath it. And as soon as he tripped the sensor, a light on the top of the garage flashed 3 times as the door not only stopped, but began going back the other way. It was clearly how the system worked if it was tripped. And so once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he saw in the video, and then also that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage, and all at once it was like the pieces clicked into place. The suspect must have followed Don into the garage. But when they went into the garage, perhaps they tripped the sensor, and so as that door was coming down, the suspect's trying to sneak in, they trip the sensor, the door stops, there's those flashes of light, the door begins to go up again, but the suspect, not wanting Don to realize what's going on, rushed over, hits the button, the door shuts, Don is none the wiser. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage appeared to be, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on this security video. But, the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Don must have known his routine. They also must have known when he would leave to take Sienna to her mother's house, and when he would likely come back home. And they also must have known that Don was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, that he wouldn't just let it sit there. He would deal with it that night. He would go down there and he would turn it upright. And when Don was doing that, that would give the killer an opportunity to sneak into the garage. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Don. They had to have known him very well. Detective Kaplan spent weeks speaking to everyone who knew Don, from coworkers to friends to his entire family, including his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad. However, they said that wasn't true of some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan the person he should be investigating was Don's own brother, Dennis. They said that Don and Dennis had had a falling out about a year earlier, but somehow, after Don's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Don's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over everything ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the family that he was just trying to help, but Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January 2017, so nearly a month after Don was murdered, Kaplan brought Don's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. And seated across the interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or irritated about it because he was innocent. Dennis said that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015. A little over a year earlier. The family had reached an agreement over what to do with their dad's possessions, but Don had violated that agreement by actually keeping one of their father's cars instead of selling it. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said that he and Don were no longer on speaking terms. Dennis said he had reached out that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Don never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that they could at some point patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder. but then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Don was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished the explanation. He didn't really buy the reconciliation story, and Dennis's only alibi was that he was home alone when his brother was killed. So Kaplan decided to push. He asked Dennis why he'd started rooting through Don's house the minute the crime scene was cleared. And at this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to do that themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Don's affairs had actually led him to a lead about the murder that he wanted Kaplan to look into. And that was that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Don's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no good explanation for what he was doing there. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole that the landlord was supposed to repair but hadn't yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into a crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair, remembering Benny Ruiz coming to the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz into the station for an interview. Like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. But he could explain why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed the dog because nobody was looking after it during the first few days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there were one person he should be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived, he'd been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse a few blocks away from Don's, and Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it so he could move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this strange, and when he ran a background check on Dennis, he discovered he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no. Now, Kaplan already knew about the criminal record because he had run Dennis's name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in his brother's life. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer, but there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don, as a loving father and a man of faith who had reformed himself after some mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with Don, over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off, and both she and her new husband Terry had alibis. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. And so there just didn't seem to be anybody who truly wanted Don dead. In February, so about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article saying the police had no suspects and no evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit that it was more or less the truth. The breakthrough that Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, so 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the forensics lab, and they told him a key piece of evidence had just come in. And the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on forensic evidence, interviews, and the police investigation, here's what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of December 28, 2016. The killer waited in the darkness right outside of Don's house until the garage door opened at about 7:40 p.m. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter in the truck, and so the killer immediately darted forward and tipped over a garbage can, and then retreated back to the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a long time. It annoyed them that everyone thought Don was so great, because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been this drug-abusing loser with 2 kids he didn't even care for, and another one who he deserved to lose in Sienna. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. so the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it. But finally, they had had enough. Dawn was just a dark cloud hovering over their life constantly, and he had to go. The killer knew Dawn well enough to figure out his schedule. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's that evening, and that he'd be coming home alone after that, and that before he went to bed, he would go into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand, which is a small wooden bat used to check tire pressure, and as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 p.m., Dawn came back, and while he was out fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind a vehicle as Dawn walked back up the driveway and pressed a button to close the garage door and then open the door to his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into position, and as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those lights flashing. And so thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to close the garage door. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement inside the townhouse that would suggest Dawn was like, "What's going on?" and coming out to check. But Dawn didn't seem to notice. And so the killer breathed out a sigh of relief and took their position near the door. And then after a while, the doorknob jiggled, and the killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon, and as soon as Dawn opened the door, they struck him so hard the tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Dawn again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage they'd been pushing down for so long. Dawn did everything he could to fight back. I mean, he had turned his life around. He had a daughter that he loved, that he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here. And so as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer. But he had been gravely injured, and when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck and hide. But the killer pulled him out and landed one last punch to his face. Dawn stopped moving, and at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and they squeezed. But the killer wasn't done. To make sure Dawn was dead, they also went into Dawn's apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, came back into the garage, knelt down, and ruthlessly slit Dawn's throat. Blood ran out of the wound and poured onto the concrete. The killer found some bleach inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could, but they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Dawn was not able to save his own life, but by aggressively fighting back, he'd given investigators a clue that would solve his murder, and also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind that solved the case was DNA found under Dawn's fingernails that belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's until 9 p.m. was a lie. And so, on April 3rd, 2017, just over 3 months after Dawn's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with murder. After his arrest, Terry cast blame on his wife, Christine, saying she was the one who put him up to it so they could have Sienna to themselves. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder, but the charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Terry, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell 2 totally insane medical mystery stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is feeling down, give them a Jack-in-the-Box toy to cheer them up. But make sure you don't give them a normal Jack-in-the-Box. Instead, give them one that's filled with angry hornets. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On November 2nd, 1848, a German doctor named Karl Heinrich August von Bureau was just opening up his private medical practice in East Prussia when a teenage boy burst in through the doors looking totally frantic. Before the doctor could ask any questions, the teenager blurted out that another boy in town needed his help right now. When the doctor asked, what does the boy need? The teenager would say, well, the boy is honking like a goose. For a second, Dr. von Bureau thought this might be a joke, but then he saw the look on the teenager's face, and he could tell he was very upset and very serious. So the doctor grabbed his bag and he ran outside with the teenager, and they hailed a horse and carriage, and they told the driver to hurry up. When Dr. von Bureau and this teenager arrived at the honking boy's house, the honking boy's mother came running outside looking totally flustered, and she flagged down the doctor and then brought him inside her house. And as she led the doctor through the home towards her son's bedroom, she explained what was going on. She said her 12-year-old son had been outside playing with his friends when suddenly he had developed this really intense coughing fit, kind of out of nowhere. And then finally, when the coughing stopped and the boy tried to breathe in, his throat made this horrible honking sound. And so her boy had come in the house honking with every breath, and so kind of in a panic, the mother had opened up her son's mouth and looked inside, but she hadn't seen anything, and she knew her son was not sick. There were no other symptoms really at all that were concerning about her son. It was just that he was honking. Now, for a while, the mother thought this would just kind of clear up, that maybe it was just kind of some byproduct of coughing really, really hard. But now it had been 18 hours and the boy was still honking with nearly every breath, which is why she had finally told the teen to go get the doctor. When the mother let Dr. von Bureau into her son's bedroom and he got a look at the honking boy, he couldn't believe how terrible the boy looked. His face was all swollen and kind of bluish, and he was sweating profusely, and when the doctor watched him try to breathe in, not only did he honk, but also very clearly this boy was really struggling just to breathe. So it was more than the sound, it looked like he was suffocating. And so the doctor rushed over to the boy and told him to open up his mouth. The boy did, and the doctor looked into his mouth, but there was nothing he could see that was blocking his airway. And so the doctor just put his finger into this boy's mouth and he reached down inside, and suddenly he felt something lodged in the boy's throat that was small and hard, and he couldn't quite grab it. So he grabbed his forceps, which are kind of like big tweezers, and he reached back into the boy's mouth and he tried to grab this object that was clearly obstructing his throat, but the object was too slippery and the doctor could not pull it out. And so the doctor is looking at this boy who's obviously struggling to breathe, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't get in there and get this obstruction out, this kid is going to die. And so the doctor made a decision right then and there to perform an emergency tracheotomy, which is a surgery where you basically cut a hole in someone's neck in order to create a hole in their throat to let air go in. But in this case, the doctor was just opening up his throat to try to get to this object. And so the doctor pulled out his scalpel and he performed the tracheotomy on this boy. He opened up his throat, and when he looked inside the hole into this boy's throat, he saw the obstruction. It was like this pink, small, hard object. And so the doctor just reached in, scooped it with his finger, and pulled it out. And right away, the boy could breathe again. He was not honking anymore. It was obvious that this fixed the problem, but the doctor and the mother are just looking at this object in the doctor's hand, having no idea how to react to this because it made no sense. The object that was trapped in this boy's throat that was making him honk like a goose was a literal goose's larynx. The larynx is a hollow tube in your throat that helps you make sound. In humans, we call it the voice box. And right before this boy began honking, he was playing a game with his friends that involved taking recently severed goosenecks and blowing through them like they were trumpets. And at some point, as this boy was doing it, he began to cough for some reason, and on the inhale, during one of these coughing fits, he had this gooseneck in front of his mouth, and so when he inhaled suddenly, he inhaled the goose larynx. And so that was why he sounded like a goose. He literally had a goose's voice box in his throat. Luckily, the honking boy would make a full recovery. If you're watching this video, then chances are good you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And if that's true, then you're in luck. Because we, Ballen Studios, just released a brand new strange, dark, and mysterious podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Each week, we'll explore new, bizarre, unheard of diseases, miraculous recoveries, strange medical mishaps, and everything in between. And like all other shows that I host, each episode of Medical Mysteries will end with a big plot twist. MrBallen's Medical Mysteries is available on all podcast platforms, and it is 100% free. But if you happen to listen to it on Amazon Music, you can listen to an entire batch of 8 episodes at once, because we release them 8 at a time on Amazon Music. But on all the other podcast platforms, we just put out 1 episode a week. And then once they catch up to where Amazon Music is, we drop another new 8 episodes on Amazon Music, but continue doing 1 per each week on every other platform. The next 8 episode binge on Amazon Music is scheduled for Tuesday, January 30th. So be sure you go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts. And make sure you stick around till the end of this YouTube video, because we're going to play a sneak peek of this coming Tuesday's brand new episode of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, which is called The Curse of Venetto. On the afternoon of February 1st, 2013, a retired Army veteran named Robert Smith limped his way into the emergency room at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Robert checked in at the triage desk, but then instead of sitting down with the rest of the patients who were waiting, he leaned up against the wall and just grimaced. Robert was in his late 60s, and up until just a few days ago, he felt like he was in the best health he had been in since leaving the service. Robert had gotten a kidney transplant 1.5 years earlier, and after getting that operation, he really wanted to make sure he stayed healthy, and so he had been going on regular walks and eating healthy, and so really he was doing great. But a few days ago, Robert had noticed this throbbing pain in his right hip that was shooting pain all the way down his right leg. And he assumed, this had to be from maybe overdoing it on one of his walks. But the pain had continued to get worse and worse over the last few days. And so that was why he was finally here at the hospital. A nurse eventually called Robert's name. And so Robert, he came off the wall and hobbled over to her, and she led him down a hallway into an exam room. Once they got inside the room, the nurse would take Robert's vitals, which were all normal, and then after doing that, she said she was going to go out and get the doctor. A couple minutes later, the doctor walked into the room, and she reviewed Robert's chart and talked to Robert about his symptoms, and then afterwards, she concluded that very likely what Robert had was something called sciatica. Sciatica is pain caused by pressure on the sciatic nerve, which travels from the lower back down each leg. And while sciatica is definitely very uncomfortable and very painful, it's not usually a big deal, and it typically clears up on its own without treatment. And so the doctor told Robert that he should just go pick up some ibuprofen, so over-the-counter pain medication, and take that every couple of hours and just wait for this thing to pass, and then he'd be fine. And so Robert was totally relieved. He thanked the doctor, he thanked the nurse, and then he left and headed back to his home. But despite doing what the doctor said and taking pain meds and just kind of taking it easy, the pain in Robert's leg did not go away. And then on the morning of February 4th, so 3 days after Robert's trip to the ER, he woke up and not only was his right hip and leg still sore, but now when he tried to stand up, he couldn't put any weight on his right leg. It just felt too weak and it was kind of tingly, something just felt off about it. And also Robert felt very nauseous. And so Robert told himself that, maybe what was going on here is he was taking too much ibuprofen and it was upsetting his stomach, and maybe it was also affecting his leg negatively or something. He didn't know. And so that day he just sat on the couch and watched TV trying to tell himself that he was okay. It's just sciatica, take a little less pain meds and you'll be okay. But that didn't work, because the next day when he woke up, he was in even worse shape. Now, he not only had this pain and weakness in his right leg, and he had nausea still, but also he now had this new pain in his abdomen that was located right around where the scar was from his kidney transplant, and Robert was also starting to spike a fever. And fevers in transplant patients are a really big deal, because a fever in a transplant patient could mean an infection. People who get transplants are then given medication that keep their bodies from rejecting their new organ or organs. This medication works by basically suppressing that person's immune system. This prevents the body from mistakenly attacking the new organ, but it also means that if their body gets a real infection, they will have a really hard time fighting it off, because again, this medicine is basically stopping the immune system. And so when Robert saw he had a fever in conjunction with these other symptoms that were not going away, he knew he had to go back to the hospital, because obviously this was not just sciatica. Robert was too sick and weak to drive himself to the hospital, so he asked his neighbor to drive him, and as they were driving to the hospital, Robert basically sat in the passenger seat, rocking back and forth, not saying anything because he was so uncomfortable, and the neighbor, the whole time they're driving, they just kept looking over at Robert, because not only did Robert look totally miserable, but also Robert was sweating profusely, like so much so that it looked like he had just sprinted a 5K. I mean, he was drenched in sweat. And so the neighbors looking at him thinking like, what's wrong with this guy? Finally, the neighbor arrived at the hospital, and Robert, he managed to get out on his own, and he thanked the neighbor, and then Robert hobbled his way back through the doors into the ER. And then a few minutes later, Robert was in an exam room and his doctor walked in, and she took one look at him and saw how horrible he looked. And without any hesitation, she said, "You're getting admitted right now." It was clear to Robert's doctors that he had some kind of virus or infection that his body was trying and failing to fight off. When they tested his blood, they saw his white blood cell count was elevated, which is a sign that the body's immune system is launching some kind of a response. But the doctors didn't know what his immune system was responding to. Even though Robert had this acute pain in his abdomen around the site of the kidney transplant, his kidneys seemed to be working just fine. And so whatever was going on with him didn't seem to be linked to his transplant. The profuse sweating did seem pretty odd, but considering Robert had a really high fever, it wasn't totally inexplicable. So basically, Robert's symptoms were weird, but kind of generic. They didn't tell the doctors specifically what was wrong with him, they just knew something was wrong. So they just hooked Robert up to an IV and began administering a broad-spectrum antibiotic, which is something that treats a whole variety of different infections. And then after that, the doctors just began testing Robert over and over and over again for all these different things that could be the cause for his illness. But every test they ran came back negative. And at the same time, over the couple of weeks that they ran all these tests, Robert just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. His fever wasn't going away, he was still sweating profusely, his blood pressure was all over the map, and he had even begun drooling almost uncontrollably to the point where he didn't even speak because he was so embarrassed about it. But to the doctors, the scariest symptom that Robert was now showing 2 weeks into staying at the hospital was he was starting to act really confused. Like he didn't know where he was, he didn't know why he was there. And so that told the doctors that, whatever his body was fighting, it had made its way up into his brain. And so the doctors knew, Robert did not have much time left, but they had tried every test they could think of, and Robert had tested negative for all of them. And so, as kind of like a Hail Mary, because they had nothing to lose, the medical staff decided to just start testing Robert for basically completely random diseases that he almost certainly did not have. But basically, if any of these illnesses had a symptom that Robert had, they would test him for it. And all these tests came back negative, except for one. On February 22nd, so 17 days after Robert had been admitted to the hospital, this test came back positive, and when the doctors saw what he was testing positive for, they immediately assumed this has to be a mistake. There is no way he has that. However, the only way to truly confirm that diagnosis was to literally cut into Robert's brain, which would kill him. And so obviously they were not going to do that. So the doctors basically just had to take this diagnosis at face value, and they tried giving various medications to Robert, but it was obvious none of them were working. And so the doctors felt like there wasn't much they could do, and they just began focusing instead on keeping Robert comfortable. And then finally, on February 27th, so 22 days into Robert's stay at the hospital, he would die from this mystery illness. During Robert's autopsy, the medical examiner was able to perform that test that doctors could not perform on him when he was alive, and that was to cut into his brain. And when the doctor cut into his brain, he saw very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, that yes, Robert really was positive for that very, very rare virus, and it absolutely is the thing that killed him. But this was not the end of the case, because the virus that killed Robert was not just rare, it was also highly contagious, which meant the doctors needed to figure out how Robert got this virus to protect other people from getting it too. But the staff at this hospital knew they were not equipped to lead this investigation, and so they handed the case over to the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, which is the world's leading disease tracking agency. Investigators for the CDC began looking into Robert's case a couple of days later. They sifted through the days and the weeks leading up to Robert's hospitalization in an effort to try to retrace Robert's footsteps to figure out what made him sick. Now, they didn't have any leads. The only thing they agreed on was that very likely, even though Robert had that pain around his scar where the transplant was, that very likely the transplant did not have to do with whatever killed him, because Robert's kidney had been working fine and his transplant had happened 17 months earlier, and typically complications from transplants will happen much sooner. And so they basically had ruled the transplant out as being the cause. But one of the CDC investigators decided to look into the transplant file anyways, just to see if maybe something got missed, or if maybe there was some detail about the donor that was relevant to what happened to Robert. And so this investigator got the file and began going through it. Robert's donor's name was William Edward Small, and at the time of his death, he was 20 years old and serving in the Air Force. Now, none of that stood out to the CDC investigator, but William's cause of death definitely did. Even though it really did not appear to have a connection to Robert, it was just so weird and unexpected. The CDC investigator would read that back in September of 2011, William was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and he caught a fish, and he ate that fish, and it gave him something called ciguatera poisoning. Ciguatera poisoning is something you get when you eat a fish that contains microalgae toxins. And so William, he ate this fish that was contaminated, and not long after that, he had died. But when the CDC investigator read through all of William's symptoms before he died, they basically exactly lined up with all of Robert's symptoms. William had developed pain and weakness in his extremities. He developed a very high fever. He became nauseous. He also lost the ability to swallow, and then he became totally confused and then died. And so when the CDC investigators saw this incredible coincidence, she knew she was onto something, but first she would need more information about William. And so very quickly, the CDC got in touch with William's family, and they asked them all these questions about William. And finally, after hearing the answers from the family, the CDC finally figured out what actually happened to Robert and what actually happened to William. It would turn out William was not just a fisherman, he was also a hunter and a trapper. And he had a very specific way he would go about training his hunting dogs. He would capture wild raccoons and use them as live bait to train his hunting dogs how to hunt. Now, William was always very cautious with these wild raccoons, but in the year and a half leading up to his death, he was bit 2 different times by raccoons. And it was one of those 2 raccoon bites, not some toxic fish in the Gulf of Mexico, that killed William and killed Robert. William did not die from ciguatera poisoning. He died from rabies, and the rabies virus that was in his kidney was still present when it was taken out of his dead body and transplanted into Robert's body. And so that was how Robert got rabies. Rabies can look like the common flu at first. People feel achy and nauseous, they get fevers, their stomach starts to hurt. Some people affected by rabies will drool uncontrollably, like Robert, or they'll lose the ability to swallow, like William. But for everybody who contracts rabies and who does not get a vaccine right away, because a vaccine does stop rabies in the early stage, so if you don't do that, everybody dies. That's what rabies does to you. It kills you. Now, you'd think, maybe we should be testing organs for rabies before they get transplanted, but you gotta remember that rabies is so rare. Only 1 or 2 people a year in the entire United States will die from rabies. And so it's just not something doctors are gonna screen for, because the percentage chance that they could have rabies is basically 0. Ultimately, Robert was not the only person who received an organ transplant from William. There were 3 other people that received his organs. Luckily, though, the CDC was able to track those 3 people down, and all of them were totally healthy and not showing any signs of rabies, so either they didn't have it or they were super early stage, which meant they were eligible for the rabies vaccine. They all got the vaccine, and they lived happily ever after. As promised, here is a sneak peek of this coming Tuesday's brand new episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. The episode is titled The Curse of Venetto. Enjoy. In the summer of 1983, a middle-aged Italian man held his mother's hands as they swayed about on a dance floor. His mother was in her 90s and was not able to get out very much, so this was an extremely special occasion. And this particular dance floor was on a cruise ship sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. It was an unbelievable experience he knew they would never forget. Then a slow song came on, and as they danced together, the man began to feel abnormally hot. Sweat ran down his chest and underneath his tuxedo jacket, his hair stuck to his neck, and when he touched his forehead, his hand came away wet. He told his mother he'd be right back, and then he left the dance floor, took off his jacket, and walked to the cruise deck, hoping the ocean breeze would cool him down. But when he got up there, he didn't cool down, and instead he just kept on sweating until his dress shirt was completely drenched. The man finally just ran to a bathroom in one of the cruise ship's long hallways, and he ran right over to the sink, turned on the cold water, and splashed it on his face. But when he looked up at his reflection, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Not because of how much he was sweating, but because when he looked at his eyes, he could see his pupils had shrunk to 2 tiny pinpricks. Suddenly, he knew exactly what was wrong. He stared at his sweaty reflection and told himself he would go back out there on the dance floor and he would enjoy this night with his mother. He had to make every second count, because he was certain he'd be dead within a year. So that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed the sneak peek. Go check out Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. In 1967, a man was digging for gold in a forest in Canada when behind him he heard this sudden commotion. It sounded like geese getting really startled and flying off in different directions. And so he put down his pickaxe, he stood up, he turned around, and what he claimed happened next is referred to as the Falcon Lake incident, and it's considered to be one of the most credible paranormal stories of all time. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button if you can borrow their favorite DVD, but instead of watching it, use it as a frisbee with your dog, and then return it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before 11 p.m. at night on May 20th, 1967, a 50-year-old man named Stephen McCulloch staggered into the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. Stephen was so physically weak that his oldest son, Mark, was there with him, physically holding him up, carrying him into the hospital. When the nurses at the front desk saw the pair walk in, they immediately got up and walked around their desk over to these 2 guys and said, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong with him?" And so Stephen at this point is so uncomfortable he can barely talk, but he takes a deep breath and then he tells the nurses that earlier that day he had been burned on his chest and stomach, and now he had this blinding headache and he was so nauseous and he could barely walk. The nurses knew clearly this is an emergency, and so they quickly ushered the pair down the hall to an exam room, and then a couple of minutes later, doctors came into the room and they asked Stephen to show them his burns. Stephen, who was already lying on his back on the exam table, slowly reaches down and grabs the bottom of his shirt heart, and he lifts it up, and the doctors are stunned at what they see on his stomach. There was a very strange burn pattern that none of them had seen before. And so the doctors, they move in to get a better look at his injury, and as they're staring at it, they ask Stefan to explain how he got this burn. Now, what the doctors didn't realize is that Stefan was very conflicted. He knew if he told the truth about how he got this burn, then he would open himself and his family up to ridicule and skepticism. But as he's laying there and the doctors are waiting for his answer, he finally decides that the right thing to do here is just tell the truth. And so he takes a deep breath and then tells the doctors what happened to him. And by the time he was finished telling this story of what happened to his stomach, the doctors had stopped looking at his injury and instead were just standing in the middle of the room staring at Stefan with eyes wide and their mouths open. They were all literally speechless. Within 24 hours, Stefan's story had made news all over the world, and his story had attracted the attention of numerous US and Canadian secretive government agencies who were keen to interview Stefan one-on-one to really find out what he knew. In short, what Stefan claimed happened to him, dubbed the Falcon Lake incident, was a very big deal. However, the farther this story went and the more people that heard it, the more people started to question the validity of this story. It just seemed too unbelievable that maybe Stefan is just lying or this is a hoax. And so before I tell you Stefan's actual account of what happened at Falcon Lake, I'm going to give you a little context about who Stefan was prior to the incident. Because ultimately, Stefan's credibility in your eyes will determine if you really believe what happened to him. Stefan was born in the early 20th century in Poland, and when World War II broke out, he was captured by the Nazis and put into one of their concentration camps. It was called the Gross Rosen camp, and it was located in Poland. During his time at that camp, Stefan would bear witness to the Nazis perpetrating some of the worst atrocities ever committed against humanity. In total, approximately 125,000 people were held prisoner at the Gross Rosen camp, including Stefan. And of those 125,000, 40,000 of them would be killed, primarily on site at the camp, or on a Nazi-led death march. After the camp was finally liberated in early 1945, Stefan worked as a translator for the US Army, helping them continue to liberate other concentration camps across Europe. But by 1946, Stefan was ready to leave Europe and start a new life somewhere else and put World War II behind him. And so he and his wife, who also was held in a concentration camp during World War II, fled Poland with their 3 young kids and resettled in Winnipeg, Canada. And for the next 20 years, the McCullochs lived a very peaceful life. Stefan would find work as a mechanic at a cement factory, and his wife and his kids would make many friends and fall in love with the Winnipeg community. However, the McCullochs' life would take a sudden turn for the worst on May 20th, 1967. That was the day of the Falcon Lake incident. Stefan was a very passionate amateur prospector. A prospector is someone who searches the earth for mineral deposits, usually gold or silver. Stefan would spend much of his off time traveling all over Canada to different wilderness areas to basically hike around the forest and up over the mountains, stopping to hack into the earth with his pickaxe in hope of discovering treasures underneath the surface. Now, Stefan almost never found any treasures on any of his prospecting journeys, but he wasn't really in prospecting for the riches. Stefan just loved being outdoors and being in nature. It was very calming and peaceful for him, and considering how traumatic his earlier life had been, being in the concentration camp during World War II, finding moments of peace in his life was very important to him. And so, in May of 1967, Stefan decided to go out on another one of his prospecting trips, this time to an area called Falcon Lake. Falcon Lake is a fairly large lake located about 100 miles to the east of Winnipeg, and surrounding this lake was a big forest that Stefan had heard contained silver deposits tucked away in the hillsides. And so on Friday, May 19th, Stefan was ready to go on this trip, and so he packed up all of his prospecting equipment, he said goodbye to his wife and his kids, and then he left the house and made his way to the bus stop where he hopped on a Greyhound bus. 2 hours later, he got off the bus at the stop closest to Falcon Lake, and from there, he made his way to this cheap motel that was right on the side of the highway. He got a room, he got a quick bite to eat in their cafe, and then returned to his room and went to bed. The next morning, May 20th, 1967, so the day of the Falcon Lake incident, Stefan woke up early, right around 5 a.m. And by 5:30 a.m., he had all of his equipment either in his backpack or on his belt, and he was making his way out of the motel's front doors. Right outside of this motel was the highway that ran left to right, and on the other side of that highway was this huge forest that Falcon Lake was deep inside of. And so after Stefan left the motel, he crossed over that highway and began walking into the woods. And for the next several hours, Stefan just kind of meandered his way through the woods. He wasn't on a trail. He was just using his compass to make sure he was generally walking in the direction of Falcon Lake. At around 9 a.m., so he's been hiking now for several hours, he looked up ahead and he saw there was a clearing on the side of this hill. And so Stefan walked into this clearing, and two things became immediately apparent. One, he was right near Falcon Lake. From his perspective on this clearing, he could look down just a couple of 100 feet, and there was the lake. And two, the reason this clearing existed and why no trees were growing on it at all is because under his feet was just a huge rock face, like a quartz vein that was running across this hillside. And so this was like the perfect place for Stefan to begin prospecting. And so he set his things down, he got out his pickaxe, he got his welding gloves on, he put on his welding goggles as well. They protected his eyes from any rocks that were flying as he was hacking into the ground. And then he got to work. For the next couple of hours, Stefan very diligently hacked away at this big rock, but he didn't find any silver or anything else of note. And so around 11 a.m., Stefan was hungry and tired, and so he put his pickaxe down, he took his goggles off, he took his gloves off, and he sat down on this rock facing the lake to have some lunch. And as he sat there enjoying his food, all he could hear in the distance were the sound of a few geese down on the lake making some noise, but other than that, it was totally quiet. After he was done eating, he put his gear back on and got back to work. About an hour later, at around 12:15 p.m., Stefan was still hacking away at the rock when, despite all the noise he was making as he smashed the ground with his pickaxe, he could hear a really loud commotion coming from behind him. And it turned out when he stopped the pickaxe, the commotion sounded like geese honking and going wild. And so he dropped his pickaxe, he took his goggles, put them up on his forehead, and then he stood up and he turned around and he looked down towards the lake where he heard all these geese going crazy. And the first thing he noticed was there were some geese on the lake that appeared to be flying off in different directions like they had been startled. But what really immediately caught his attention was not the geese, but what had very likely startled the geese. And that was two bright, glowing red objects that were flying slowly across the lake towards him, kind of roughly over where the geese were. Yesterday, my pet frog, Seagull Lung, and I went to the frog park. And as I watched old Lungy gallop over to his other frog friends to join their game of Hi-Li, I noticed something very distressing. Poor old Seagull Lung was the only frog not in a Halloween costume. And so immediately my parental instincts kicked in and I sprinted over and ripped old Lungy off the Hi-Li field. And then before long, we were speeding home at over 100 miles per hour where we crashed into the front of the house. And then after climbing out of the twisted steel and wreckage, me and old Lungy hobbled over to our steam-powered laptop, and after getting that bad boy fired up, I was on the internet looking for the best Wolverine costume for frogs money could buy. But as I was browsing, I got hit by a pua. Luckily, old Lungy slapped me right in the coccyx and said, "Papa, toutefois, NordVPN."
Papa, tu dois avoir.
Papa, tu dois avoir. Papa, tu dois avoir NordVPN. Which, of course, in French means, Dad, we need to sign up for NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe while you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the space. Not only will NordVPN ensure all of your information stays safely behind their next generation wall of encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature called
threat protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting puas that keep preventing us from purchasing the best things in life, like Halloween costumes for frogs. So, be like me and old Lungy and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan for a huge discount plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. And now these objects, they were cylindrical. They appeared to be about maybe 30 or 40 feet wide. They didn't have any sort of emission coming off of them. They weren't making any noise. They were just kind of slowly making their way over towards where Stefan was. Now, as Stefan is watching this happen, he wasn't fearful. He assumed those have to be military aircraft. As it was, this part of Canada, Falcon Lake, is very remote. There's not many people around. And so logically, it made sense that perhaps there's a military that's doing training exercises in this area. And so feeling much more intrigued than fearful, Stefan just continued to watch as these red aircraft got closer and closer to his side of the lake. And then when these two craft were about 200 feet away from where Stefan was standing, they came to a stop and they were just hovering in the air, and then one of the craft suddenly turned orange and began going up into the clouds, and then at some point just vanished. And then the other craft, instead of going up, just continued descending very slowly, now very clearly towards this open rock face that Stefan was standing on. Now again, Stefan was totally convinced that these were military aircraft, conducting some sort of exercise, and so he's not fearful. He is just intrigued by what he's seeing. And in fact, by this point, he had convinced himself that this second aircraft that was now coming down to land on these rocks must have experienced some sort of issue, and they were landing in order to fix it. And Stefan even thought to himself, well, hey, I'm a mechanic. Maybe I can help the pilot or pilots with whatever's going on with their craft. Once the craft finally did touch down on the rocks about 150 feet away from Stefan, it changed colors from red to stainless steel with an orange glow around the outside of the aircraft, and inside of this craft, a really bright purple light came on that Stefan was only aware of because there was a couple of small holes on the outside of this craft where this purple light was coming through. But these little rays of purple light coming out of this craft were so bright that it actually was hard for Stefan to look directly at the craft. And so his welding goggles were still on his forehead, so he pulled them down, put them over his eyes, and his welding goggles had a kind of tint to them, so it was like he was looking through sunglasses, and with those on, he was able to continue looking at the craft. And so through his goggles, Stefan is still just standing in the same spot where he first saw these craft, and he's watching this craft that's now landed 150 feet away from him, and he's fully expecting any minute for the pilot or pilots to come out of the craft and explain what's going on. But at first, nothing happens. And so Stefan is just standing there waiting for something to happen when he realizes he has his sketchbook in his pocket. Stefan liked to bring his sketchbook along on his prospecting trips because he liked to sketch things. And so he figured while he waited for the pilot or pilots to emerge, he would sketch the craft. And so for the next couple of minutes, that's what he did. And then after he was done sketching it, he put his sketchbook away, and then really nothing happened for about another 30 minutes. He just stood there, and the craft remained motionless. But after about 30 minutes of the craft having landed, it opened. There was like a sliding door on the side of the craft facing Stefan, and it revealed the beautiful, bright purple interior of this craft. But from Stefan's perspective, because of how bright the lights were and how far away he was, he couldn't tell what was inside of the craft. But Stefan's thinking, okay, clearly now the pilot or pilots are coming outside. And so Stefan felt really relieved, and he was just standing there waiting to talk to whoever was inside. But again, nothing happened. And so now, feeling just plain curious, Stefan decided, you know what, I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to yell into this open door to the pilot or pilots inside and make sure they're okay. And so he starts slowly making his way across the rock face towards this craft and this open door. And when he gets about 60 feet away from the craft, he suddenly stops, because now he can hear from inside of this craft the sound of two voices talking to each other. He can't really tell what they're saying, but very clearly there is communication happening inside of this craft. And so Stefan assumed that must be the pilots, and so he called out to them in English. And the second Stefan yelled out to this craft, the voices immediately came to a stop, and they did not respond to Stefan. And so Stefan is calling out to them in English, hey, are you okay? What are you doing in there? And when English didn't work, Stefan called out in Russian. He called out in German, Italian, French, Ukrainian. And when all of those didn't work, he went back to English and just continued kind of calling out, trying to get them to please come out and talk to him. But he got no response, and no one came out of the craft. And so at this point, Stefan thought, okay, I'm totally committed, so I need to keep going and make sure the pilot or pilots are okay. And so he continued walking closer and closer to this open door of the craft, and when he got about 10 feet away, he was suddenly struck by the incredible craftsmanship of this craft. He couldn't see any rivets anywhere on this amazing piece of machinery, meaning this craft appeared like it had somehow been carved out of one enormous piece of steel, which seemed totally impossible. Also, Stefan noticed there were no insignia on the outside of this craft. There was no flag or anything kind of denoting who was flying it. There was really nothing on the outside of the craft. But Stefan just kept on going until he was standing right outside of this open door. He's only a couple feet away from it, and now he's looking directly inside, and he doesn't see the pilot or pilots. And in fact, because of how bright this purple light is coming out, even with his goggles, it's really hard to see what's inside of this craft. But he can clearly see inside there is some sort of panel in the back of the craft with lots of flashing lights, almost like a computer, and there were other kind of columns of light moving around inside the craft at different angles. But after looking in this craft for only a few seconds, the door suddenly slid shut. And then Stefan, without really thinking about it, reached out and touched the craft. And the second he did that, two things happened. One, the hand that he touched the craft with, he was wearing a big welding glove, and the second he made contact with that craft, the leather glove began to melt. Not even catch on fire, it just instantly began to melt. And so he began frantically ripping the glove off to get it off of him to avoid injury. And then the second thing that happened is the craft began rotating counterclockwise until this vent that was on the outside of the craft, one of the very few things that was on the outside of the craft that actually Stefan had noted in his sketch. He had drawn this grate that sat on the outside of the craft. This grate rotated around until it was aimed directly at Stefan. Now, to picture this grate, picture like a vent you would see inside of a building where air conditioning blows air out of, right? It's kind of like that same size, the size of a license plate on a car. And instead of there being vertical slats along the vent, like you would see with an air conditioning vent cover, on this vent, on this craft, it was like a checkerboard pattern with little buttonholes all over this vent. And so Stefan is looking at this vent, and then suddenly something shoots through the vent, like an explosion that hits him square in the chest and lights him on fire. His shirt is literally in flames, and so Stefan is frantically trying to rip off his shirt. He throws it on the ground, he's stomping the flame, and as he's doing that, he looks up and sees this craft has somehow immediately shot into the sky and is now disappearing into the clouds. Now, Stefan had no idea what just happened. All he knew is his chest and his stomach now hurt tremendously. But before he could deal with that, he developed this unbelievable headache. He suddenly felt so nauseous, and he felt delirious, like he was drunk. Trying not to panic, Stefan, who now is shirtless and badly burned, he ran over and grabbed some of his things, and then he began heading back into the woods to make his way back towards the motel. It would take him several hours of stumbling through the forest, stopping periodically to vomit, but he would eventually reach the highway, he would cross over, and he would make his way into the motel right around 4 p.m. And when he got there, he made his way into the cafe, and he asked the staff if they knew where the nearest doctor was. These staff members would later tell investigators that when Stefan came tumbling into the cafe without his shirt on, looking totally horrible, they assumed he was drunk. But after talking to him, he didn't smell at all like alcohol. Instead, he reeked of this horrible sulfur smell. The staff would tell Stefan that the nearest doctor was 45 miles away. And so at this point, Stefan decided his best bet was actually to just get on a bus and go back to Winnipeg, where his family could take him to the nearest hospital. And so somehow, Stefan managed to make his way to the bus stop. He hopped on a Greyhound bus, he went to Winnipeg, and then his oldest son, Mark, met him at the bus stop and practically carried him into the hospital. The very strange checkerboard burn pattern found on Stefan's abdomen, where he claims this craft turned its vent and fired on him, were determined not to be thermal burns, meaning he didn't get them from something hot touching his skin, like everyone initially suspected. Instead, they were determined to be chemical burns, but literally no one, doctors, scientists, government agencies, no one could figure out what chemical actually burned his skin. In fact, no one was ever able to actually identify what was causing all of these ailments that Stefan was complaining of, from the headache to the nausea to the weakness to these burns. And he was tested for basically everything, from radiation poisoning to very common ailments and illnesses, and everything came back negative. Experts would go out to Falcon Lake, to the area that Stefan described seeing this craft, and sure enough, they would find an open rock face, and right around the area that Stefan described was this circular burn pattern, as if something had been perched right there that shot some sort of exhaust into the ground, and the area around this landing site was determined to be highly radioactive, although it is assumed that the reason that area is radioactive is because there is a vein of radium that runs underneath the rocks near the area. However, what no one could explain away were the 3 identical pieces of what looked like metal, which actually turned out to be a very rare type of silver, that were located near this burn circle. Now, even though the Falcon Lake area was known apparently for having silver deposits up in the hillsides, this silver, these 3 pieces of silver, were not from the hillsides of Falcon Lake. This silver was heavily manufactured. Someone, something, some machine had manipulated the metal to bend and be cut in a very particular way. And all 3 of these pieces of very rare silver were highly radioactive. They would also find traces of this very rare type of silver that seemed to have seeped into some of the loose rocks that were inside of that burned out circle, almost like the silver had melted into the rock. But despite these pieces of evidence that do seem to suggest that Stefan really did see some craft land on these rocks, and despite the fact that the US government and the Canadian government both thoroughly investigated this case and they were not able to debunk it, they basically said, well, something happened, but we don't know what. Despite all of that, Stefan and his family's lives were forever upended after this incident. Stefan was ridiculed and accused of lying and of being crazy, and his kids were unfortunately bullied at school. Shortly before Stefan died in 1999 at the age of 83, he was asked if he regretted coming forward with this story. And he would say, yes, I wish I never told anyone. But he would also say, at the time, he really felt like he had a duty to tell the world about what happened. Stefan never changed his story, and he never came out and said, I think this craft came from another world, another planet, another universe. He just said, look, I think it was an experimental aircraft. That's it. He also never made a dime on this experience. If anything, he lost money because he paid to write a 40-page pamphlet that explained what happened to him, and then he left all these copies on his porch. So if news people showed up or if nosy neighbors showed up and had questions, he would just point to the stack of the books and say, take one and read it. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can borrow their favorite DVD, but instead of watching it, use it to play Frisbee with your dog and then return it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive episodes on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Right now, that podcast is available on all platforms, but starting on November 1st of this year, 2022, the podcast is going to be exclusively available on Amazon Music. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Español. We also put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today's story is about a police officer in Argentina who encounters something totally inexplicable by the side of the road. Some have called this story one of the most credible paranormal stories that exists. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their new fresh produce with wax replicas. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the night of March 2nd, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Pucheta rode his motorcycle down a dirt road in rural Argentina. It was pitch black out with no streetlights, and on either side of the road were mostly open fields, interspersed with patches of forest, and there were mountains rising up in the background. There was nobody around him for miles. This was an area called La Pampa, and it was famous for its beautiful landscapes and cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers, who came out here at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and birds that often sold for lots of money on the black market. It had been a quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something illegal. At around 10 p.m., Sergio was riding down the road towards a crossroads that locals called El Cruce de las Cañas, and up ahead he saw the red taillights of a car. And at first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop, but then it turned off the road and drove into this nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field, and then these taillights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. Maybe, he thought, this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide from Sergio. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and he parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out, it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he didn't bother to take it out because he didn't want to give away his position. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this vegetation the car had gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. I mean, the entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact. And so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this road, looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he couldn't find any. Like, there was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation. And so eventually, Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange chirring sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he couldn't just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. So he took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glint in the darkness. And for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought, that's got to be the car. I've caught them. They're right here. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring, so terrifying, that for a second, he just stood there frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him, so he opened his phone and said hello. But Sergio didn't say hello back. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Cañas. You know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, what's going on here, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio didn't answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio. And so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too. Because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him. Every time they had tried to call him back, he wasn't answering. Meanwhile, the backup, 3 police cars full of officers, sped past cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas, where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, like his actual location, they found his motorcycle, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle, and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again, they were met with silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down, looking for any sign of Sergio. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, "Over here!" Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought, okay, well, maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger until finally the gap from one step to the next was 10 feet apart, then 15 feet apart, and then 20 feet apart. I mean, even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance to cover. I mean, this was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear. There was no mistaking this was a human footprint. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints. But now they just walked in silence. For more than 1 mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and trees until they arrived at a cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In 2017, I left the military after 7 years, and I knew reintegrating into civilian life was going to be a challenge, but I was not prepared for just how much of a challenge it would be. When you're in the military, it's like you're sort of in a bubble. It's its own world. And so once I was out of that bubble in the real world again, I was shocked by just how much I didn't know how to do. I didn't know how to use new technology. I didn't know how to find a good job. I didn't even know what a good job was. Like, the jobs themselves were confusing. And on top of all that, I was struggling with really dark, intrusive thoughts that were making my life kind of a living nightmare. However, instead of sharing this with anybody, I just held it in, and it only made my issues worse. Luckily, my family noticed I was really struggling, and they stepped in and they encouraged me to seek out help with a therapist. And I took their advice, and honestly, I don't know if I would be here if I hadn't. So if you're really struggling right now and you're kind of holding everything in, you really ought to consider giving therapy a shot. And one of the most accessible therapy platforms out there is BetterHelp, and they're on a mission to make starting therapy easier. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched with a therapist in as few as a couple of days. And if that therapist is not a good fit for you, you can easily switch to another one who is at no additional cost. BetterHelp makes sure all their therapists are well qualified, and their customer support team is always there to help you. So if you're struggling and think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour at around 2 a.m. But the officers never gave up. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police couldn't find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and he saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball and he was sitting in the mud. Now, keep in mind, this area is like in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through the area, and so to see anybody was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so, feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man, but didn't get a response, and so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped around him, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer couldn't see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining, and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet, this man was totally dry. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Sir, are you okay?" But the officer didn't react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It didn't take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Pucheta. But Sergio wouldn't talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He didn't appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with him. So the officers called an ambulance and they summoned Sergio's boss to see if he could get Sergio to respond. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the ground, but still Sergio wouldn't speak. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back and he sat with him and then went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio didn't want anybody to touch him, and he was very anxious, and he kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have injuries. I mean, he figured he had likely been assaulted or kidnapped. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, as the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he'd been standing on a hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk. And here is the totally wild story that he told. At 10 p.m. the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he didn't. There was no car. There were no poachers. When he turned, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then before he could do anything, the eyes began to move closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes, these were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they didn't appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that's when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. But then suddenly he felt this intense pressure in his torso, and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever seemed to be in control of him, but he couldn't. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards, like his back is arched in this totally unnatural position, and he's marching out of the trees. And then as he's doing this, he watched helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone. And then he dialed the number of that officer, and then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend, "Come to Las Cañas, you know what to do." And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassemble it and drop the pieces on the ground. And then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures are just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he didn't hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky. And for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again, he was lifted back up. And this time, he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again, and again, and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they didn't stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield. And as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw were swaying corn stalks and darkness. And for a moment, he's thinking, maybe this is all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then, once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him are two red glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself. But it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas. And now, here's a clip from the latest episode of Run Fool. Enjoy.
I just got a weird call, and sorry, I was supposed to record an episode on this haunted doll, but that can wait. Because I just heard let me get my bearings here. I'm rattled if you couldn't tell. I just hung up the phone. No, wait, sorry. Let me backtrack a bit. I've been in the recording studio for, it's got to be more than 24 hours. Maybe more like a day and a half, something like that. See, we had a lot of Run Fool episodes to get through, and I'd fallen behind. So I suggested we knock them all out this weekend. Maybe it's the tortured writer in me, but I love an all-nighter. Feels good to retreat from the world. Leave my life, my friends, family, just work. Anyways, it's been me, our sound engineer Kevin, and our producer Abakar, here in the booth. No cell phones, no drama, nothing but Doritos, Pepsi, terrifying legends, and a voice in our heads, telling us we have much to do, and not enough time to do it. A few hours ago, I made Abakar go out and get us all some grub, something that wasn't bright orange. He hasn't come back. And before I got this call, I was pissed about that because I was hungry, and it felt like he was wasting our time. But then, the phone in the recording booth rang. I guess it's not a phone exactly, it's one of those intercom things where you can call between studios in the building. There was a man on the other end, a stranger. He sounded almost manic. I don't know if he could hear me, since he kept asking if anyone was there. Seemed like he hoped there was, though, because he kept talking. Told me quite a story. I'm going to need more time than usual to tell you this one. It's not some campfire fright night I can get through in a half hour. It's too big for that. Too irreversible. So I need you to buckle in and stay with me here. You hear that? Kevin just left to see if there's any truth to what this caller said. If there is, it means Abakar isn't coming back. Kevin might not either. Because if what this guy said is true, everyone outside this booth is dead.